Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. On August 16th, 1982, an unidentified attacker brutalized and strangled Maggie Hume at her apartment in Battle Creek, Michigan. The daughter of a beloved local football coach, her seemingly senseless murder sparked intense scrutiny that lingers even today. Award-winning author Blaine Pardoe and his daughter Victoria Hester crack open 3 decades of material on this mysterious tragedy, exposing dark secrets and political infighting that tore at the Battle Creek legal system for years. Compiled from documents, videos, and interviews, this book presents the facts and clues of the case to the public for the very first time. The book that we're featuring this evening is The Murder of Maggie Hume, Cold Case in Battle Creek, with my special guests, journalists and authors, Victoria Hester and Blaine Pardoe. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Victoria Hester and Blaine Pardoe.
Thank you for having us on the show, Dan.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Incredible book, very fascinating story, an unsolved murder. Again, a little bit unique twist on murder on this particular episode of True Murder. Now, again, without giving too much away, give us, Blaine, first, your connection to Battle Creek and, as a result, this story.
I'd be happy to. I was raised in Battle Creek, Michigan. I now live outside Washington, D.C. I was raised in that community. Matter of fact, Maggie Hume and I are of the same age. We graduated the same year, albeit from different high schools. I write a wide variety of books, military history and true crime, etc. And while I was doing a book tour for another book that I had written on an unsolved case in Battle Creek, people just kept coming up to me and saying, "You've got to take a look at this murder of Maggie Hume." It occurred while I was off in college at the time, and I do remember bits and pieces of it. So I started doing a little bit of digging into it. I actually got approached by one of the members of the prosecutor's office who had been an investigator on the team, and he said, you've got to take a look at this case. And I said, well, I've done cold cases. They're harder to write for in the true crime genre. Is there some interesting twists and turns to this? Is it something that would make a compelling story? And he just kept assuring me, you need to take a look at this, and you need to pry open this case. And once we did, it was absolutely remarkable, the kind of the journey that we went on, as well as the journey I think the readers go on, in taking a look at a cold case and why a cold case doesn't get resolved in some cases, as well as some of the incredible and twisted characters that kind of emerged during this whole investigation. It was absolutely probably one of the most incredible experiences that I've had in terms of being a writer in many years.
Yes, absolutely. It is certainly a journey. Now, Victoria, this is your father obviously is a veteran author, an experienced author, award-winning author. What brought you to this project specifically? Why did you want to do this story? How did you come to write The Murder of Maggie Hume along with your father, Blaine Pardoe?
Well, at first he had mentioned the story to me, and I was really interested in it, just from the vague information he had before we fully researched it. We've kind of been looking to do a project together. I've always enjoyed writing. I wrote a couple papers I won awards for in college. So I really just enjoy writing, and I've always wanted to write a novel or a book. And he invited me to do it with him, and of course I jumped at it. I love true crime. It interests me. I love true crime shows. Anything true crime just fascinates me. And the fact that it's a cold case is really fascinating. But once I got into the research part of it, I just felt a draw to her. You know, Maggie herself, we're the same age-ish. We were in the same stages of our life, so it was really interesting. I felt like a personal connection to her. So it was really special, actually, to write the book.
Now, Blaine, maybe you can tell us, because you have even more experience with the area than your daughter, Victoria, but tell us really because you do set the scene very much so in this book, to tell us really what kind of place it was in 1982, what kind of place really Battle Creek really was, what kind of community it really was. And, of course, we talk about the central figure in this, too, is her father, Mike Hume, and the St. Philip Catholic High School, that he is a big person on campus with the football coach. And really, so tell us a little bit about the background of Maggie Hume, but first tell us about really what kind of community Battle Creek really is, and how you portray it in the book.
Well, you know, Battle Creek is a Rust Belt city. It's part of the industrial mix. It's nestled in between Chicago and Detroit on I-94. I think everybody has heard of Battle Creek, Michigan. You know, if you watched Captain Kangaroo as a kid, you saw the commercials for Kellogg's and Post. You knew, you know, that Battle Creek is kind of America's cereal manufacturer. And really, that was a major component of that town. It's really a part of it. Battle Creek is a town of 50,000 people, and you know, it was really struggling in the 1980s. It was undergoing a lot of change. You know, the city was kind of decaying in the interior of the city. The outskirts of the city were being developed with malls and plazas and things along those lines. Crime was really starting to peak for the first time, and I think it put some stresses on the police forces at the time, you know, to be able to kind of cope with the crime along these lines. It used to be in that time period, if you had a murder or two every few months, that was a rarity. You just didn't have a lot of that type of crime occurring, especially if someone, of such a respected family. Battle Creek has a very closed Catholic community. And it's not that they're closed from a perspective of inviting in people, but it's a very tight-knit community. It's almost like a society within the society itself. There's a lot of closeness there. One of the things we've come to appreciate, both of us, when we were writing this book and when we spent time in Battle Creek, is how tight that community is, which I never realized as a kid. Maggie's father was the athletic director at the only Catholic high school in town. The graduating classes were very small at this school, double digits in terms of their size. It's a very close community, and here you had the daughter of one of the, someone who was highly respected and acknowledged, as a coach in the community. His daughter is brutalized and murdered in a very savage manner. And that crime, it hit a lot of the people that they said, God, if it could happen to a family like this, an upstanding, church-going, family, how safe are any of us? And it put a lot of pressure on the Battle Creek Police Department. It's still, while it's a city, it's got that small town feel to it, and it's gritty and it's rough around the edges, and they were struggling with a strong desire to both solve this case, but make sure they solved it 100% correct, and that led to some of the problems down the road in terms of the investigation.
Now let's go back a little bit to the characters that we encounter in this story. And primarily, the most important, of course, is the victim, Maggie Hume. So, Victoria, through this, I'm sure that you were involved in all aspects of the research on this book, and two authors are maybe even better than one in terms of doing even more research. So tell us what you did find in writing this book about Maggie Hume. Take us, the reader, back, the listener, back to Maggie Hume's life. She's 20 years old. She's a cheerleader. She has a boyfriend. She has friends. She has 3 girls that call her best friend. So take the listener back and tell us who Maggie Hume really was.
Well, she was a graduate of St. Philip High School, Catholic high school. So it's a very small high school. She was 20 when her life ended. Between the time from high school to the time of her death, she was going to Kellogg Community College, and she was currently working at a doctor's office as a secretary. She was a flirt. She was sassy. She was fun to be around. She was always the life of the party. Everybody wanted to be Maggie's friend. From what we don't know her, but we tried as best as we could to describe her as if we did know her. We talked to a lot of people that, so many people claim to be her best friend. It just goes to show you that people wanted to know her, to be friends with her. She was always fun, and she was definitely flirty. She definitely liked boys. She did have a boyfriend of over a year. His name was Jake Carter, and he comes into play later in the book and also in her life. But they were pre-engaged, so there was no engagement yet, but they were definitely talking marriage. So she had a lot going on for her. She was about to graduate the Kellogg Community College. She had a job. She had just moved out of her parents' house with her roommate, Margaret, and they had only lived in the apartment for a couple months before she was murdered at the apartment.
Now let's talk about, you talk about her being a flirt, but let's talk about some of the other things about her character in that, again, everybody liked her. She, everybody thought of her as a best friend. But she was an honor student. She was pretty ambitious when she set goals. This is a pretty, in terms of, typically they try to find some dirt on people, that there is something, some secret. But really, from all the research that you've done, this is a pretty ambitious, straight, smart, ambitious person, isn't it?
We found when we were looking at this, you're talking about somebody who was a cheerleader, someone who, went to dance class. It's not that she was 100% sterling clean. It was the 1980s. The most that we found was that they did drink beer, that her and her friends, they were underage and drinking. But, I can attest for my own life at that time, I was doing the same thing. There just wasn't Maggie wasn't a person that generated enemies. She didn't have anyone that had a reason to kill her, at least on the initial surface. As the investigation, after the police found her body, they really started to take a look a little more at the relationship she had with her boyfriend, which really kind of unravels as you go through it, because it's one of those things that even today you look at these types of situations, you realize how a relationship can get out of hand and become kind of an obsession for some folks. And but that added to some of the problems. If she had been a rabble-rouser, a rebel, a danger, creating lots of animosity and stuff, it would have given the police a lot to go off, but they really didn't have a lot with Maggie at that time. So
I'll ask Victoria to go through the actual particulars of the day before and the turn of events. Her interaction with her best friend was also named Margaret, and she worked for Dr. Chadwick, I believe, and so that's the first. There was some indication that she was missing. And of course, this punctual, responsible person doesn't show up for work. So tell us about the day before, which is the 17th, and tell us about the turn of events.
So during the day, she had worked that day. After work, she had gone to her parents' house with her friend. They were eating outside and talking, and they were talking. Her boyfriend did come up in that conversation, and it wasn't a positive conversation. Later that evening, she had headed home, and her boyfriend had come over. In his story, we only know his story. He had stayed late, and they had watched MASH together. They had made soup for dinner, and then he had left. He said around 11:30. And then the next day, her roommate actually came home early from picking up her sister at the Detroit airport. And the only reason why we know she came home extra late is because she phoned Maggie during that time to let her know that she would be home very late, past 4 o'clock in the morning, and told Maggie on the phone that if she did hear something, that it was just Margaret and not to worry. There was nobody breaking the apartment. It was just her. The only person that knew Margaret was going to be that late was Maggie and her boyfriend, who was present at the time of the phone call. And Jay Carter, who is the boyfriend, did admit to knowing that information. So anyway.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the things that really stood out for us and stood out for the investigators in this was as you saw this kind of unfold in terms of the sequence of events, this was the only time Maggie had ever been alone in the apartment. And she was worried about that. She had told her boyfriend and had told her friends that she was very concerned about being alone that night. Her boyfriend was 2 years older than her and was, did not spend the evening with her that evening, which kind of raised a few eyebrows with the investigators. If you think about when you're 20 years old and your girlfriend has the apartment to herself alone in the evening and she's afraid, you would think somebody would opt to say, why don't I'll stay with you or you come back to my place or whatever. That really wasn't the case. And it really narrowed the focus, as Victoria had said, towards Jay Carter at the outset, simply because this was a crime that took place at around 2 in the morning. The neighbors heard a scream, and as they went through this, when all is said and done, there's only a few people that really even knew that Maggie would be there and be alone at that time. And it really boiled down to her roommate knew, who was in Detroit with her family, and Jay Carter and Maggie herself. Those are the only people that knew.
Now, there are a lot of other things that start to point right towards the boyfriend, and that being that he tells police that there was a phone call at 10:30 from a guy that he thought had sounded black. So, Victoria, if you could elaborate on what he told police about in terms of the phone call that Maggie received at around 10:30, he had said.
Yeah, he had claimed that Maggie had answered the phone at 10:30, and we do know that from the phone record that somebody did call at that time. He said that she was acting very odd on the phone and hung up the phone and said, oh, it was a black man calling, and he just stated, my Maggie baby, on the phone, and it freaked her out, and she hung up. Later on through the investigation, we actually found out that it was Maggie's ex-boyfriend from high school who had called and was confirming a beer order that they were ordering for her roommate's birthday party. Whether or not Jay Carter knew that, he was known to listen on the other phone to her conversation. So whether he knew that or not is kind of, or if she tried to play it off and lie to him, we're not sure about. But the fact is, that wasn't who called. It was confirmed that it was her ex-boyfriend that she was still currently friends with, and it was just a beer order.
Now, to complicate this further, when he talks to the Hume family, to the brother, and this is away from police, he has another even more elaborate story, even as you claim in the book, a more sinister story or elaboration of the same story. So if you could tell our audience what that elaboration was, adding more suspicion to this character. Well,
yeah, Virgil J. Carter, every time he kind of told the story, it got a little bit larger and a little bit more convoluted, and which is a red flag for anybody, that I'm sure your listeners, as they go through these true crime books, it sticks out. He was claiming that the person was had made threats to her that night. And you got to bear in mind, it's 10:30 in the evening. She's there alone. said that it was threatening and that she was very scared by all of that. Yet, an hour later, he ended up leaving Maggie there alone, according to him at the time. Every time he told the story, he added or embellished a little bit more to the account, kind of playing up much more what was really nothing more than the boyfriend, her former boyfriend, calling and saying, I've secured the beer for your roommate's party. And the fact that Maggie pretended in front of her boyfriend that it was nothing more than a crank call, given that Jay Carter was known to be very obsessive and possessive of Maggie. She really didn't have very much time on her own when he wasn't there at some point. And he was very controlling of her. That very well could have been a trigger point for what occurred later.
Now, I want to concentrate on this guy because I find it hard to believe, regardless of the lack of DNA technology in 1982, and forensic things can happen or not happen, and mistakes can be made. It's incredible that there was any focus on anyone else ever, and that there really wasn't. They weren't able to really crack this guy at all in terms of some of the inconsistencies and some of the suspicious behavior that he had. What was his alibi? I know he had his own residence, and what was said too is that Maggie was often known to spend time, or occasionally known to spend time, at her boyfriend's apartment, so that when her best friend Margaret came back at 4:30 from the airport, she didn't think too much of it, per se, till the next day when she was kind of looking at the apartment and it looked like something was out of the ordinary. So what was his alibi, and how did police check that alibi or not check that alibi?
Ultimately, his alibi was he simply went home that evening, that he was unconcerned, that Maggie wanted to be ready to go to work the next morning. So he just simply left her, and no one knows actually his whereabouts from the time he left that apartment until the next morning when he received a phone call from Maggie's office saying that Maggie had not shown up for work, and they were curious, did he know where she was? It's not uncommon, if you think about it. Any one of us, you leave somebody's house, go home for the night, you may not have someone there to validate, when you arrived, etc. But when police investigators look at this, one of the first things they try to do is find the person who was last with the victim, because often they have the most information regarding what was going on with the victim. And Jay Carter was very much trying to allude that whoever had made this mysterious phone call was somehow kind of tied to this. And in later discussions, his behavior, as you mentioned, his behavior afterwards was highly inconsistent with someone who had lost someone that they were practically engaged to. He mentioned to the family how her body was found, where the body was found in the apartment, and how it had been placed in the apartment. But he wasn't there when the body was found, and the police had never told him. Matter of fact, at the time, the police hadn't told the family how this had happened. So Jay Carter was in possession of knowledge that, frankly, he didn't have any way of knowing unless he was there and involved as part of the act of disposing of that body. His behavior as well, while he was, prior to Maggie's funeral, he was trying to ask out Maggie's friends to go on dates, which again is not a behavior that's kind of consistent with someone who'd be going through a mourning process at the time. His stories were very inconsistent. Every time police talked to him, the stories were inconsistent. But what kind of kicked in is that small town piece again. The police really weren't comfortable on moving on Jay Carter unless they had 100% solid case. because of the family's reputation and prestige in the community, they were nervous about going to trial or arresting someone, not having an airtight case, and having that person potentially get off. And that hesitation, which is so common with small town politics and small town police forces and investigations, it really, in this case, served against getting Maggie the justice she so richly deserved.
Now, Victoria, a question I would have, and I think maybe the listener is listening here, maybe this can be really cleared up easily by the police just interviewing Jim Downey and asking him specifically what he did have a conversation with, and I know you alluded to that, but then when they realized that Jim Downey couldn't have been sounding black or saying likely my baby Maggie, and that it was innocent because his brother, he had a reason to be calling her, a certain reason. And then from that, it would seem that a motive could have been jealousy, the alibi that doesn't stick. So how do police proceed with Jay Carter, and what do they do? Is he under surveillance? Does he want to speak to a lawyer? How does police proceed, and how does Jay Carter proceed?
Well, he was obviously never arrested, never charged, even to this day. It's still an open case. Jay Carter was questioned multiple times. He was under surveillance by the police. He didn't do anything that, at that time period, that would flag him for anything. I mean, he was acting like his normal self.
Really, it was kind of interesting as we were going through it. At one point, the officers they interrogated him around 4 or 5 times, and we went through the transcripts of those interrogations, and it's really easy to spot the discrepancies in each time he accounted the story. And we tried to account for that in the book as well, just so that the reader can kind of form their own opinion on these things. As we went through it, what really jumped out, we interviewed one of the officers who did the investigation. He said, I thought I had him broken at one point. He said, we had an interrogation. He had his elbows on his knees. His head was in his lap, and he said, I knew I had him broken. And he said, and the chief of police kind of interceded at that point and said, let's hook him up to a polygraph. And as part of the interrogation, you only get one attempt to really break somebody, and to have somebody else walk in the room and say, okay, stop what you're doing because we need to set up a polygraph, several hours later and arrange for that, you lose that momentum. Jay Carter was taken in for a polygraph and failed that polygraph. And we've gone through the transcripts of what he went through during that interrogation. It is clear, from what the polygraph operator said, that he has knowledge of who killed Maggie and is withholding that information, and that really stood out again for investigators. But again, as we all know, polygraphs are inadmissible in court, but it's definitely a steering point. Along the same lines, they brought in Jim Downey, and they hooked him up to the polygraph. And
Sure.
He failed the first attempt, and his first response was, when he failed it, was, hook me up again. Let's get this resolved, at least from what we read in the police reports. And they re-polygraphed him, and he passed his polygraph. Jay Carter was offered numerous attempts to undergo a polygraph to kind of clear his name on this. And on multiple occasions, he declined to do that or did not show for his polygraph session. I don't know about how anybody else feels, but if my fiance or my girlfriend was murdered and I thought police were taking a serious look at me, I would be doing just about everything to clear my name, so that they could focus on who the real killer was. And again, this is where we see his behavior doesn't match what you would normally expect of someone who's who is a suspect.
Now, like any great true crime book, just when you think you know who the culprit is, and I love that when I just saw Dateline program the other day, and there's a Dateline reference in this book too, is that lots of times you think you know who's done it, but a prosecutor comes and says, "Listen, we got some evidence, and besides, you had some other murders. Patty Rosansky, you had Carrie Evans, and you had some satanic elements." Tell us about how this case goes kind of in a different direction for a lot of people. And a very important element of this story is the battle between prosecutors and police, and the people on one side believing they know who the suspects are, and on the other side. So this book has just begun to unravel. So tell us a little bit about that.
So a few years pass between, nothing's really going forward. Jay Carter is never arrested. He's never listed anywhere in the media as a prime suspect. All of a sudden, a guy who's serving time in Arkansas, his name is Michael Ronning. He's actually serving time in Arkansas for a murder he committed there, and he's serving life without parole, suddenly confesses to murders in Michigan. And one of the murders that he confesses to is Maggie Hume. He also confesses to the murders of Carrie Evans and Patty Rosansky. All of a sudden, they decide to move him to Michigan to question him further, to take him and, get a further confession out of him. His confessions are very vague for all three murders. He's very vague on how they were killed, very vague on the time of day, vague on every detail, where the bodies were, what they were wearing. Each one had discrepancies, but when he talked about Maggie's murder specifically, he had 43 discrepancies in what actually happened and what he said happened. Now, it kind of doesn't make any sense how is this guy from Arkansas suddenly confessing to murders in Battle Creek, Michigan. But actually, at the point of Maggie's murder, he was actually living in the same apartment complex and actually left the state to go to Texas the day her body was found. So to prosecutors, to police officers, that was a red flag. Why is this guy who happened to live in the same complex and he leaves the next day? Like, what are the odds, honestly, of that? So that flags it for them. But once they go into further detail, his confession isn't credible. It's just 43 indiscrepancies. It just, in the polygraph that he did take for the confession of the murders, he was so vague in his answers. He said he murdered 3 people in Michigan, and that was pretty much the gist of it. That's all he would give. At a certain point, they end up moving him back. But the main problem was between the prosecutor's office and the police officers of a different jurisdiction.
Yeah, what really emerged in all of this is you've got a guy who lives in the apartment under Maggie who is arrested and is trying to broker a deal to get transferred back up to Michigan, primarily because his family's in Michigan, and Michigan does not extradite on death sentence cases. And there's the strong belief that Michael may have killed other people in states like Florida and Texas where the death sentence is in place. What really started to occur is you've got 2 investigators that were with the Battle Creek Police Department, both very good investigators, who completely believe 100% they've solved the Maggie Hume murder, but they've solved 2 other crimes. Now, what complicates this is the murderer of Patricia Rosansky, a man by the name of Thomas Kress, had already been convicted of that crime and was serving time in jail. And there was a belief by the investigators that the prosecutor's office was ignoring the confession of Maggie Hume to try to protect the conviction of Thomas Kress in a completely different murder. And what really occurred, and again, this is where the small town aspects kind of come in, are the 2 investigators got the local TV stations, their United States senator, various governors and other legislators involved in this to not only try to force the issue, to try to force the prosecutors to accept this false confession, but to also try to release Thomas Kress from jail, which they now claim he is falsely imprisoned for. And I don't know if Thomas Kress committed the murder of Patricia Rosansky or not. We really didn't want to kind of muddy this, but to your point, it really goes in this strange direction where you're so you've got this lock solid case on Jay Carter, but now suddenly you have somebody who's trying to make a jailhouse confession and essentially broker a deal to his advantage to get transferred up to Michigan. And it caused a lot of a horrible rift between the prosecutor's department and the police department. The police department was saying, look, we can tie a ribbon on 3 murders. Let's do it. And the prosecutors were going, but if you look at these confessions, they are fraught with problems. And it began a legal battle around the Thomas Kress release that went all the way to the Michigan Supreme Court. And it was the Michigan Supreme Court that essentially ruled that Michael Ronning's confession in the case of Patricia Rosansky was completely false, that it had no basis in reality. And if it's false on Patricia Rosansky, in many respects it places into question his other 2 confessions, both for Carrie Evans and for Maggie Hume. But that legal battle dragged out for years, and it involved multiple prosecutors, and really got played out on a national stage with the Dateline being pulled in by the police officers to try to once again kind of force that issue.
Now, this case is cold for a long time, but in 2005, something somewhat significant, another cold case investigation. Tell us about what happens in 2005 with this case.
Well, I got to tell you, it's a credit to the investigators that after all of this goes down and they still don't move forward with either one of these suspects, Jay Carter or Michael Ronning, the Calhoun County Prosecutor's Department, the Sheriff's Department, as well as the Battle Creek Police Department form a cold case team. And what they do is none of the individuals involved were the people that were involved in the political aspects of all of this. They went into this with a fresh set of eyes. They reopened the case. And it was never made public until we put it in the book, but they came to a solid conclusion looking at all of the gathered evidence, re-interviewing many of the people that are still with us, who are associated with this case. Their conclusion was hands down that it was Virgil J. Carter was indeed the person that killed Maggie. And they made a recommendation to the prosecutor's office to move forward and initiate prosecution of J. Carter. But there's still that hesitancy given all of the publicity that this case had been drawn through. There's still, you're dealing with essentially a circumstantial case in many respects. Now, most murder cases are circumstantial, and
right.
I know everybody likes watching CSI Miami, and they like thinking it's all very technical, and it's each one of these is a slam dunk with physical evidence. A lot of them are just that. They are circumstantial cases. The prosecutor hesitated at the time to do this, but we've had very good cooperation with the prosecutor on our Freedom of Information Act, and the prosecutors made it very publicly known that they're hoping the book will bring forward new testimony, new witnesses, things along those lines that will help them move forward with the prosecution. It is everyone we've talked to that still believes this case is prosecutable. And it can still be executed. And we've gotten some tips even when we did our book tour. We had people coming up to us with ideas, suggestions, and tips that were not in the police reports, and we've turned those over to the authorities to act on.
Now, for the purpose of this interview, too, just to show you or show our audience that has been watching CSI for 15 years or so and watching investigation discovery of newer investigations centered around, say, DNA or other technology that's current. In 1982, let's go backwards and go back to Maggie Hume and go back over how her body was discovered and the suspicious behavior of Jay Carter in terms of where he was found while Maggie Hume's brother was searching the roommate's apartment, or room, I should say. And so when he was found near the closet. But what I wanted to ask, too, was the state of CSI, as you mentioned that. Were there scrapings under her fingernails? The other thing that we sort of skipped over was, how did the police look at this when they saw that she really needed glasses? Her roommate said she had a spare pair, but they weren't on the nightstand, that she couldn't really get up to go to the washroom without her glasses. What did that tell her? What did that tell police, I should say? Was there anything under her fingernails that would indicate a struggle? What was the assessment of say the entry into the home, because the boyfriend had keys to the apartment, but what did police determine in terms of how the perpetrator got into the room to conduct the assault and murder? Again, tell us a little bit about that. I apologize to the audience, but going backwards in time with this crime scene, again, to who did it point to?
Well, we know for a fact that her body was found in her closet of her bedroom, and she was covered with what is referred to as a snuggie sack, which is basically a snuggle sack, like a sleeping bag kind of thing. And it was covered. It wasn't visible when you first looked into the closet from just looking, but if you did move things around, you would see that her body was there. Before all that, we do know that the point of entry into the apartment was from the sliding glass door from the balcony. We know this because not only was the front door locked, and it was only able to be unlocked from the outside and locked from the outside, that there was grass clippings leading from the balcony door into her bedroom, and only into her bedroom. There was no grass clippings found in the roommate's bedroom, in the bathroom, nowhere else. So we know that the person did not check, whoever broke into the apartment, whoever was her killer, did not check to see if there was another person present in the apartment, which you would think if you're going to break into someone's apartment to harm someone that you would check to make sure that there are no witnesses. The last thing that you would want to do is, attack someone and then a roommate come in. So we found that to be odd, too, that whoever broke in knew that Maggie was alone, or was pretty confident that she was alone. We know that Maggie had laid down for bed that night. She had set her alarm for work the next day, and the alarm was actually going off the next morning. So we do know that she set it, and we do know that she had her glasses off. And like you referred to, Maggie did not ever take her glasses off. She could barely see. She wouldn't even go to the bathroom without her glasses. Her vision was that bad. So we know that she was in bed for the night. That's as far as we know with her. We know she was attacked around 2 a.m. because of the scream that was heard from the neighbors, and that the perpetrator had come in through the sliding glass door and had left that way. Besides that, the next day when she didn't show up to work and her boyfriend was called, he ended up calling her brother, and they came to the apartment to look out and see maybe if they could figure out where she went, if she left a note, if they could see where she went. For some reason, Jay Carter was looking in her room, obviously. He noticed that he was looking for a certain pair of shoes. He wanted to see what shoes were missing to figure out where she had gone. He was on his hands and knees in the bedroom, in her closet, looking for these shoes. It just kind of seems odd that, that was a place he was looking, and for some reason he was looking for shoes to figure out where she was, but that he didn't find her body at any point. He obviously didn't look that well. I mean, she wasn't hard to discover. If you just lifted the blankets, you would have seen her body. And the brother did find that, he didn't find it odd at the time, but he did later on.
Yeah, if you think about, I talked with one officer, and he summed it up. He said, 1982 forensics and police investigation, he said, you were just coming out of the era where it wasn't uncommon to, if there was a murder in a house, to find the officer sitting there eating the cold pizza off the desk, that they didn't seal the crime scene. I don't want to say it was a Keystone Cops thing, because it definitely wasn't, but the police had walked through the apartment looking for her body, hadn't found it in the closet. It was only when her roommate said, look, you guys didn't do a good job. I need you to check thoroughly. Look behind the sofa. Look in the closets. I don't want to stumble across my roommate's body or anything, because you didn't search. It was only then that the police actually found her remains. One of the things we tried to do with this book, and we were able to get access to the crime scene photos, is really show you that closet in a lot of detail. And Maggie's shoes were in the closet where her body was wrapped, etc., and her legs were literally on top of her shoes. So anyone who would be even trying to look at the shoes in her closet would have to move her legs to be able to even see those shoes. Jay Carter's comments were, "Well, I was looking, I didn't see them." But, quite frankly, he was on his hands and knees. He was less than 2 feet from where her body was. And if he was reaching into that closet, he was practically he would have had to touch her body to see what shoes were there. But according to him, he didn't even notice that. The police, after they found the body, they accidentally locked the bedroom door and locked themselves out. They had to go get the manager to open it. It wasn't the best of crime scene investigations. They did check under Maggie's nails. There was no sign of a struggle. She was strangled with a ligature. They believe it was either a belt or a tie, and was wrapped around her throat, and she was choked. She had also been sodomized. So whoever did this, it was a very savage attack, and whoever it was someone who had access to that apartment, knew how to get into that apartment. And to Victoria's point, I think, and it's something that stood out with all the investigators and with us, is if it was a random attack on a young girl, any other night, her roommate would have been there. So someone would have had to go down the hall to see if the roommate was there. And they would have left a trail of grass clippings as they did going in and out of the apartment. They just didn't, whoever it was went in for one purpose. They went in, attacked and killed Maggie, concealed the body, and left. So it really points to someone having that inside knowledge that she was alone that night.
Also, his behavior after the indication that she was missing, that he said he went to the St. Philip's High School to look for the father, Mike, and of course he said he didn't find them, and when he and John, the brother, went back to the school, there he was in his office. And as you say in the book, he didn't seem too surprised to find him there. So again, more and more compounding circumstantial evidence against him in terms of his demeanor, all his post-murder behavior, no alibi, no real solid alibi. It seems like with his past behavior, a propensity for violence and a background somewhat towards being at least jealous, certainly, and under the circumstances of someone making a phone call. Now, with the 2005 case and up to this point, who are the officers and who are the main agents behind believing that they still have Jay Carter as their number one suspect?
Well, we've talked to a number of them. Bill Howe, who just recently left the prosecutor's department, very distinctly pointed to Jay Carter, as did Randy Reinstein and some of the other folks in the Battle Creek Police Department. We talked with some of the former prosecutors, Nancy Mullett, and a few other folks as well, and it was just absolutely 100%, across the board. Mike Scherzer, who is on the Battle Creek City Council now, and several other folks, they've all kind of seriously pointed. They said there's no doubt in their mind, that Jay Carter was involved with it. Jeff Cabot, who was with the prosecutor's office, was really, he buried himself in this case. I mean, he just immersed himself in the details, and he's one of the people that found all the discrepancies in Michael Ronning's, version of events, coming in with a fresh set of eyes. So we didn't find anyone other than the two original officers who felt Michael Ronning was, based on his confessions, was a viable candidate. We didn't come across anyone that was really in the Ronning camp anymore, that they solidly believe it was Virgil J. Carter. Our book was the first time that we ever made public, who the prime suspect was. For all these years, J. Carter has been kind of living, a great life that Maggie was denied. He's never been named in the newspapers, even as a suspect, etc. And then if you think about if indeed he was the killer, here while he's doing this, somebody else comes along and confesses to the crime. So we kind of went out on a limb, and we had to make some very tough decisions as writers, and spoke with our editor on this, etc. And really decided that the right thing to do was to name the names, just like a newspaper reporter would do if they found out, who the prime suspect was. So we did do that, and kind of an intriguing twist when we were there for our book tour this autumn, when we were there, that Jay Carter had moved back into the area recently. So kind of an interesting twist.
Now, I know that you alluded to the politics of a small town, but if I am like many of the listeners listening to this program right now, you talk about most cases are circumstantial cases. There is a hell of a lot of circumstantial evidence against this person that they didn't almost get a confession. He almost got a confession. He said he was close to cracking. But really, was there, in many cases, I've seen far less evidence, far less circumstantial evidence, and then a motive is created based on as much the motive that seemed to be here present. And certainly once he had created this story about a black man and the telephone call, which was easily reputed. So why wasn't there enough evidence? Is there any detectives in this story that said, geez, I was disappointed that they couldn't get an indictment to take it to a grand jury? I mean,
I think that's one of the reasons they reached out to us, to be honest with you, Dan. I think there's a general sense of this case can be solved and should be solved. Victoria and I, we did a lecture in Battle Creek on this, and we had almost a dozen of the former officers who over the years had worked this case and showed up. Nothing irritates a police officer more than a murderer who got away with it. They all, to a person, were like, this is solvable. A number of them have actually volunteered. Now that they're in retirement mode, they volunteered to work on the case and work free of charge, pro bono, to drive this case to closure. So, the hunt is on. I firmly believe that. And as I said, the community has come forward with tips, which, I don't know which ones have gone directly to the police, that we haven't heard of, but the ones we've received, we've passed on. There's two aspects to this. I look at Jay Carter and say he's the only person that's alive today that, other than the roommate, that knew that Maggie was alone that night. But, there was an eerie case incident that took place months beforehand where at a St. Philip's volleyball game, he was caught under the bleachers choking Maggie and threatening to kill her and put her body in a dark place where no one would find it. Wow. Now, one of the witnesses, the prime witness on that, has since passed away, but there are two other witnesses who witnessed that, who identified Jay Carter as the person that said that. It's kind of eerily reminiscent. Here he is choking her, and she died of strangulation. She was found in a closet, buried under a snuggle sack and some dirty clothes. It's incredibly creepy to have someone come out and say that. And to me, that was always one of the things that I think if I had been an investigator and I had heard that comment, I would have been, we've got to go arrest right now. But, the profile of this case just grew, especially after Dateline NBC got involved. it became something that went beyond the local level and really became this huge national thing. So now the pressure is actually even on more. And what prosecutors, they're facing a double challenge here. If you go to convict Jay Carter, the Michael Ronning confession is going to come up. So you not only have to make a great case against Jay Carter, but you also have to make a case against the Michael Ronning confession. And that adds a level of complexity to it. And a lot of the folks that were involved in the prosecutor's office said that confession out there is going to be one of those things that we're going to have to fight, if this goes to trial. Because if you're mounting a defense for Jay Carter, that's one of the things you're going to rely on.
Now, you have evidence like that, again, when we watch CSI or Criminal Minds, obviously this stuff, some of it got lost, but there's just a tiny shred of DNA, and that's all we need now. He sodomizes her. There has to be pubic hairs. In those days, they analyzed hair analysis. There was, again, fibers. You had grass. You had lawn clippings. So was there no forensic evidence that was gathered properly or gathered at all that could have been used in 2005 with DNA and other forensic techniques?
There is some DNA evidence that was obtained. The primary problem that you run into is Jay Carter doesn't deny being in the apartment that night. Sure. Jay also openly admits that night he and Maggie did make love. And you can claim that there's the potential for seepage of the semen, from the vaginal area on down, that you could end up with cross-contamination. So if you do have a swab that proves who was there, it may very well point to Jay Carter, but Jay Carter's already admitted that he had intercourse with the victim that night. So any fibers that you're going to find are completely assumptive of, the fact that it wasn't there. I think the one thing that the DNA would have proven, and it did come out in a little bit in some of the court case against Michael Ronning, was when they sampled some of the DNA, it couldn't 100% rule out Michael Ronning, but it also didn't rule him in. It was inconclusive on Michael Ronning. That's really where I think the DNA comes in more, is to not prove that Jay Carter was in contact with the victim that night, because he's already admitted to that multiple times. The real thing it can do, the only thing it can really do, is prove 100% in some way, shape, or form that Michael Ronning wasn't there. And when they did the tests, which was, again, in the late 80s, early 90s, it wasn't able to prove or disprove Michael Ronning. It was inconclusive. And you got to remember, too, every year, DNA testing is able to do more and more with less and less of a sample, but every test that was done in the 90s and the 80s, they used up considerable pieces of the sample. And I've been told by one of the investigators they still have some DNA, but not a lot. And so they've got to be able to use it and use it wisely.
Was the sodomy considered by, say, the pathologist to be a sexual assault, or was it consistent with, I don't want to get too graphic, but could he have said that this was part of the forensic, part of their sexual play, normal part of it, or was there an indication that there might have been two separate perpetrators in the DNA sample? Tell us a little bit about that.
I'm going to turn that over to my daughter, who's a nurse, who crawled through the autopsy report in much more detail.
Yeah, during the autopsy report, the sodomization was very violent. It was significant damage. We know that was not typical of her. She actually is quoted to her friends that she did not enjoy sex at all. So that would definitely not be something she would even be willing to do if she didn't enjoy sex. And the fact that it was violent, there was multiple tears and lots of damage, that goes to show you that it was more of an attack and not something planned or something that they had planned on doing.
Now, one more question for you, Victoria, while I have you, is you said that she had a conversation, one of the last conversations with anyone, and one of the witnesses was her friend, her good friend, her close friend. What you said it wasn't a positive conversation about her boyfriend. What exactly was that conversation in the context and the content therein?
She was basically complaining about how controlling that Jay Carter was over her life and that she was planning to break up with him. So whether she had planned to do it that night, whether she had, it was in her mind. So kind of what we were thinking could have happened is that they got in an argument at some point during the night and she had tried to break up with him. That's kind of what I would assume would have happened, especially if she was talking to her friends about it. It made it seem pretty serious.
And if Jay Carter was there and he heard the phone call and Maggie blew it off, we know that Jay Carter occasionally listened in on the other phone to hear who Maggie was talking to. If he knew it was her former boyfriend and then Maggie denied it, he may have assumed that Maggie was still seeing this guy on the side. And, that rumor was floating around. And that adds to the level of the complexity to this. We'll never 100% know what happened in that apartment unless the killer really comes forward and says this is exactly the sequence of events that took place.
Now, that's the segue I would like to, we'll wrap up in a few minutes, but I wanted to talk about this honorable effort that you've done. And you say that you got the Freedom of Information, through the Freedom of Information Act, you were to get information that the media, and as a result, the public had no idea about. So the particular silver lining of this book could be that they could get a conviction after all these years. As you say, authorities involved in this case say that it's prosecutable. It's very prosecutable. It's possible. It's plausible. Now, I'll ask Victoria, and then I'll ask you, Blaine, too, as well. Specifically, because I've read about a lot of cases. Unless he has told someone and divulges information to someone, and that person then comes forward now, because lots of times these things generate even just stories in the media, let alone a purposeful book like this specifically. Tell us, Victoria, what your hope is. What do prosecutors and yourself and your father think that is the likely thing to happen? What bit of evidence will be the thing that may break this case after all this time?
Our sincere hope is, regardless of who killed her, regardless of who the suspects are, that her murderer is brought to justice. To us, it doesn't matter if it's Michael Ronning. It doesn't matter if it's Jay Carter. It doesn't matter if it's some guy that we haven't even heard about. The fact is, we just want it solved, not just for her family, for everyone. This has been 30-plus years of a nightmare that hasn't ended. And to us, we just want it solved. We want her brought to justice. After all this time, she deserves it. It would just, honestly, it could just take a tip. It could take someone that overheard something that at the time they didn't know was even relevant. But now, after reading the book, after hearing more information about the suspects, that now it makes sense. It could be someone sitting, at an airport and they heard something somebody said. And at the time it wasn't important, and, as more information comes out, it is now. So honestly, it could take a tip, it could take a confession. It wouldn't take a whole lot.
And Blaine, the same question in terms of maybe more specifically, what do you think is the best bet for investigators or for authorities in terms of how they would have evidence that would be compelling enough to then be able to prosecute this? Not another
I'll tell you,
bit of...
You hit the nail on the head. Somebody always knows something, and a lot of times, if people think on a cold case that, especially after 32, 33 years now, you take a look at a case like this and you go, well, They're never going to get me. Somebody slips and they say something to somebody. I talked to one officer on a different case completely, and he said sometimes it takes a case going cold for someone to relax enough to say something stupid, and they say it to a former wife, they say it to a lover, they say it to a buddy over beers. They slip up and they say something, and at the time the person goes, yeah, whatever. But then those relationships get soured and things change, and suddenly when something comes up like the attention we've tried to bring to this, when you do that, it really makes it so somebody goes, wow, gee, that didn't seem like much, but in the context of this murder was out there and this guy was the suspect, with the public never knowing that Jay Carter, for example, was a suspect in this, without them knowing all the details of the Michael Ronning confession, anything that either one of these guys may have told somebody, you just may have blown it off. But now it means something because there's that context that you could attach it to. Some of the tips that we've gotten seem incredibly small. Having said that, when you compare them against other things that people have said, they actually help substantiate things. And that's, I think this is one of those cases where loose lips sink ships, that at some point one of these gentlemen said one thing or another to someone, and if that person comes forward, this is going to roll. And we finally get to write the last few chapters of the book, the arrest and the conviction.
Now, you said you had to somewhat tiptoe or at least be aware of the legal parameters of being able to say this person is a suspect, but based on the evidence that we have, and we're not naming him as the culprit, but just as the suspect in terms of police reports and information gleaned from the police. Was that the case?
Yeah, it wasn't that we consulted with a lawyer, although, God, we talked to enough of them. If you think about it, the police, if you read the newspapers all the time, they name people of interest, they name suspects in crimes, etc. For some reason, and we never found out why, they never named Jay Carter the suspect in this. And we took a look at it, and as long as we stuck strictly to the facts of the case, and that was kind of our measuring stick throughout this, was to stick to the actual testimony given to police, etc. There's nothing that really can be said. This isn't I don't know Jay Carter, even though I'm from Battle Creek. I didn't know Jay Carter. I don't have an axe to grind here. I'm just relaying information that's publicly available. You could file a FOIA today. Go down and pull this information and see it for yourself. That's part of how our system of government works when it comes to information. So, I didn't feel we were at risk here, and everybody we talked to, kind of felt the same way. That as long as you're sticking to the facts, and we really leave it up for the reader, but we try to provide them the same palette of information that the investigators were working with. And we leave it for the readers to form their own opinions. I've had people come up and tell me that both of these guys clearly did it. And you go, okay, well, that's good. And, that gives you an idea of how hard it'll be to have a case go to trial, because juries are made up of normal people.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask Victoria, overall, the experience of being involved in a case like this and still an active, open investigation, really, as a result of, like you say, anxious investigators still ready to, if and when evidence comes in, be able to process that, look at it, even volunteer officers to look at this information to see if they can prosecute. What was the experience overall like for you, writing with your father, investigating this to the depth that you had to? Tell us about your overall experience in writing this book.
It was long. It was long hours. We traveled to Michigan multiple times. One time in a blizzard of 16 inches of snow. It was pretty terrible. But it was interesting. I've never done something as in-depth as I've done on this book with any kind of research. It was time-consuming, but it was worth it. Researching and piling things together and separating it by chapter and going through police reports are not fun to read, nor are they easy to read. You gotta just drill through it. But to me, it was a blast. In the end, I had so much fun. I love to write, so it really helped on that. But it was great, and I really liked working with my dad. I wasn't sure how that was going to go, but so far it was great.
Right. And for you, Blaine, how was it working with your daughter on this book? Is it really true two authors are better than one?
Yeah, it was kind of our relationship changed a little bit, all for the positive, because we were co-authors on this. And it was interesting. The first few times she would read my stuff and say, "I'm not comfortable with the way you worded this," I could tell she was a little hesitant raising that. And I said, "No, you're doing your job. That's what we do with each other. We edit each other." And it was, for me, a lot of fun to have somebody to talk this over with. When you're writing a book on like this alone, it's hard for even your spouse to kind of keep up with all the stuff. But having Victoria work on this with me, I was able to go, "Hey, reread that page, and take a look at that last paragraph. Tell me what you think. Do we need to call this person? Do we need to probe at this a little bit more?" We really spent a lot of time doing it. It's been fun. It totally changed our relationship in some respects, and I think it made it a lot more fun and a lot more interesting. I'm looking forward to my next project with her.
Absolutely. Now, at the same time, like I say, this book is part of an open investigation, or anxious investigators. This freedom of information is out there. Obviously, you've named the likely suspect based on this evidence. When you have done interviews so far, when you have done appearances so far, what has been the overall reaction? I know it's because you've written a different type of true crime book based on what I've just described. Tell us, Victoria, what the appearances are like, and sort of the focus and the tone of them.
We try to keep everything. We give a lot of facts. Our PowerPoint and our lectures are very fact-based. We keep our own opinions out of it. We don't tell anyone our personal opinions on the murder. We want the reader to decide for themselves, look at the facts, make your own educated guess at who you think the murderer is. Or is it somebody that we don't know? We want it to be as unbiased as possible. We want the reader to completely decide for themselves, and I think that's the only way you can look at it. If you give your opinion, then, how is that going to help solve anything?
We were really surprised, I think, during all of this that, we had communicated with the Hume family, primarily with Maggie's brother, John Hume, who represented the family. And we'd done it over email, back and forth. He read a copy of the book before it ever went to press or even to edit, just so that he could make sure that there were no surprises in there, because we don't know what the family's been told over the years. And I think one of the most rewarding things for us is when we did one lecture in Battle Creek, where we had 180-some people show up who wanted to know what was going on with this crime. To have the mayor of Battle Creek in there, the prosecutor in the audience, and at one point somebody said, "So how'd the family react to all this?" And they said, "Well, I can't speak for them, but they seem to be very supportive." And in the back of the room, John Hume, Maggie's brother, raised his hand. He said, "Hi, Blaine. It's the first time we met face to face," and I let him answer it. And he said we were respectful of the family, and we had stuck to the facts, and this was an accurate representation. And that, to me, was probably one of the most rewarding moments as a writer. You look at all this other stuff, but there's people actually that are attached to this that are still in pain, and that's Maggie's family and her friends. And hopefully, this will break this loose. I can see why a lot of true crime writers don't tackle cold cases. There's a lot of nervousness and risk with this, but it's worth it every step of the way.
Right. Well, I want to thank you both, Blaine and Victoria, for coming on and talking about the murder of Maggie Hume, the cold case in Battle Creek. A very fascinating book, and thank you very much for coming on and talking about this book. I want to thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
All right, you too.